The winter of 1887 was brutal in the Appalachian Mountains, but it wasn't the cold that made people disappear. It was something far more sinister, lurking in the misty hollows, where even today, locals refuse to venture after dark. Deep in these ancient peaks, 7 religious groups emerged between 1880 and 1970, each claiming divine revelation. But their version of salvation came with a price paid in blood, terror, and unimaginable suffering. These weren't your typical mountain churches. These were cults so twisted, so ruthlessly violent, that federal authorities spent decades trying to erase all evidence of their existence. The stories I'm about to share with you have been deliberately buried, hidden away in classified files and sealed court records. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about religious freedom in America. Today, we're uncovering the darkest chapter in Appalachian history: 7 deadly cults that turned remote mountain communities into theaters of horror. Their methods were so brutal, their beliefs so warped, that even hardened federal agents refused to discuss what they witnessed during raids. Some of these groups practiced ritual sacrifice. Others convinced followers to commit mass suicide. And the most terrifying part? 3 of these organizations may still be operating in the shadows today. Before we dive into this nightmare, I need to warn you. The details I'm about to reveal are disturbing. These aren't sensationalized stories or urban legends. Every incident I'll describe is documented in government files, survivor testimonies, and crime scene reports. If you're easily disturbed, now might be the time to click away. But if you're ready to learn about the most dangerous religious movements in American history, then let's begin our descent into the darkness that still haunts these mountains. The first cult on our list emerged from tragedy and desperation, but what it became was pure evil incarnate. In the winter of 1883, a charismatic preacher named Ezekiel Whitmore arrived in the remote settlement of Crow's Hollow, West Virginia. He came carrying nothing but a worn Bible and promises of salvation for anyone willing to follow his radical interpretation of Scripture. Whitmore's message was simple yet terrifying. He preached that the end times were imminent, but only those who proved their devotion through blood sacrifice would be saved. At first, his followers sacrificed animals during elaborate ceremonies held in abandoned mine shafts. But as winter deepened and food became scarce, Whitmore's demands escalated dramatically. The turning point came on Christmas Eve, 1883. Whitmore announced that God had revealed to him the ultimate test of faith. He selected 7 families from his congregation and told them they must offer their youngest children as sacrifices to ensure the group's survival. What happened next shocked even the most hardened investigators, who would later examine the crime scene. 12 children, ranging in age from 3 to 8 years old, were led into the depths of an abandoned coal mine. Their parents, completely under Whitmore's psychological control, participated in a ritual so horrific that the federal agent who first read the survivor's account immediately resigned from his position. The children were arranged in a circle around a makeshift altar carved from mine timbers. One by one, they were sacrificed while the congregation sang hymns that echoed through the tunnels. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. 3 children managed to escape during the chaos. They ran barefoot through the snow for miles before reaching the nearest town. When authorities arrived at Crow's Hollow 3 days later, they found the settlement completely abandoned. every building had been burned to the ground. The only evidence of what had occurred were the charred remains in the mine shaft and the testimonies of the 3 traumatized survivors. The most disturbing detail from the investigation was what they found carved into the mine walls. Hundreds of symbols that didn't match any known religious iconography. Investigators brought in experts from universities and theological seminaries, but no one could decipher their meaning. Even more unsettling, similar symbols were discovered at other crime scenes across Appalachia over the following decades, suggesting that Whitmore's influence had spread far beyond that single settlement. Ezekiel Whitmore was never found. Some believe he died in the winter wilderness. Others think he escaped to start new congregations in more remote areas. But the most chilling theory comes from FBI files that weren't declassified until 1995. According to these documents, a man matching Whitmore's description was spotted at religious gatherings in Kentucky, Tennessee, and North Carolina throughout the 1890s. Each time, children in those communities began disappearing shortly after his arrival. The psychological techniques Whitmore used to control his followers became a template that other cult leaders would adopt throughout the region. He isolated families from outside contact, created artificial scarcity to increase dependence, and used religious authority to justify increasingly extreme demands. Most importantly, he understood that in the isolated mountain communities, people were desperate for both spiritual guidance and physical survival. What makes Whitmore's cult particularly terrifying is how quickly ordinary families transformed into willing participants in child murder. Psychological analysis of the survivors' testimonies reveals that Whitmore employed sophisticated manipulation techniques that wouldn't be formally identified by psychiatrists until decades later. He created an us versus them mentality, convinced followers that outside authorities were agents of Satan, and gradually normalized violence through incremental escalation. The 3 child survivors never fully recovered from their trauma. 2 died by suicide before reaching adulthood. The third, a girl named Sarah McKenna, lived to age 67 but never spoke publicly about her experience. However, her private journals, discovered after her death, contained detailed descriptions of the cult's daily operations and Whitmore's psychological control methods. These journals became crucial evidence for federal investigators tracking similar groups throughout the 20th century. Perhaps most disturbing of all, Sarah's journals describe how Whitmore claimed to receive direct communications from what he called the ancient ones who dwell beneath the mountains. He told followers that these entities had existed long before Christianity and demanded blood offerings in exchange for protection and prosperity. This blend of Christian imagery with pre-Christian mythology became a recurring theme among Appalachian cults, suggesting either a shared source of inspiration or direct influence from Whitmore's teachings. The investigation into Whitmore's cult revealed something that authorities tried to suppress for decades. The symbols found in the mine weren't random carvings made by a madman. They formed a coherent system of communication, almost like a primitive alphabet. When researchers finally decoded portions of the symbols in the 1960s, they discovered detailed instructions for conducting human sacrifices, recipes for psychoactive drugs made from local plants, and what appeared to be maps of underground cave systems throughout the Appalachian region. This discovery led to a classified federal investigation called Operation Mountain Shadow, which ran from 1967 to 1974. The investigation uncovered evidence that Whitmore's cult was just one cell in a much larger network of interconnected religious groups operating throughout Appalachia. These groups shared the same symbols, similar ritual practices, and most disturbing of all, they appeared to be coordinating their activities across state lines. The federal agents assigned to Operation Mountain Shadow discovered that at least 6 other cult groups were using variations of Whitmore's symbol system. They found evidence of regular communication between these groups, shared safe houses for fugitive members, and coordinated recruitment efforts targeting vulnerable mountain communities. What started as an investigation into a single 19th century cult had uncovered a shadow religious network that had been operating for nearly a century, but Operation Mountain Shadow was abruptly terminated in 1974 when 3 federal agents investigating a cult compound in eastern Kentucky disappeared without a trace. Their vehicles were found abandoned on a remote mountain road, but despite extensive searches, no trace of the agents was ever discovered. The official report blamed their disappearance on a hiking accident, but classified documents suggest that investigators believed they had been murdered by cult members who had learned about the federal investigation. The termination of Operation Mountain Shadow meant that most of the evidence about Whitmore's cult and its connections to other groups was sealed in classified files. What little information has been released paints a picture of a religious movement that was far more organized and dangerous than anyone had realized. The cult didn't die with the abandonment of Crow's Hollow. Instead, it evolved, adapted, and spread throughout the mountain regions like a cancer that federal authorities couldn't fully excise. Today, law enforcement agencies in West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and North Carolina maintain special task forces dedicated to monitoring cult activity in remote mountain areas. While they publicly deny any connection to historical groups like Whitmore's cult, internal documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests tell a different story. These task forces have investigated dozens of incidents involving ritual symbols, unexplained disappearances, and reports of religious ceremonies conducted in abandoned mine shafts. The legacy of Ezekiel Whitmore's cult extends far beyond the 12 children who died in that mine shaft in 1883. It established a template for religious extremism that would be repeated throughout Appalachian history. More importantly, it demonstrated how isolated communities could be completely controlled by charismatic leaders who understood how to exploit desperation, fear, and genuine religious faith for their own twisted purposes. The symbols carved into that mine wall in Crow's Hollow weren't just the ravings of a madman, they were instructions passed down through generations of cult members who continued Whitmore's work long after his disappearance. And according to some investigators, those instructions are still being followed today in the deepest, most remote corners of the Appalachian Mountains, where the old ways never truly died and the darkness continues to claim new victims. Moving beyond the shadowy network of Ezekiel Whitmore, we encounter the second of our 7 deadliest Appalachian cults. This one emerged from the deepest hollows of eastern Kentucky in 1901, where desperation and ancient hunger collided in ways that would make even hardened investigators question the very nature of evil itself. The blood covenant of Pine Ridge began not with religious fervor, but with a mother's desperate love. Martha Hensley, a widow with 4 starving children, had watched 2 of her babies die during the brutal winter of 1900. When her remaining son fell gravely ill with consumption, she made a choice that would curse her bloodline for generations. Local legend spoke of a hidden grove deep in Pine Ridge, where the Cherokee had once performed their darkest rituals before abandoning the area centuries earlier. The natives called it the Hungry Ground, warning that it demanded payment for any favor granted. On a moonless night in February 1901, Martha carried her dying son through knee-deep snow to find this forbidden place. What she discovered defied everything she thought she knew about the mountains she'd called home her entire life. The grove was perfectly circular, surrounded by ancient oaks whose bark bore symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in her lantern light. At the center lay a stone altar stained black with what could only be centuries of dried blood. As Martha knelt beside the altar, clutching her fevered child, she felt a presence that made her skin crawl and her teeth ache. The voice that spoke to her didn't come from any direction she could identify. It seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath her feet, vibrating through her bones and into her soul. "Your child can live," it whispered, "but life requires life. Blood calls to blood. Will you feed the hunger that dwells beneath?" Martha's response would echo through the mountains for decades to come. "Yes," she gasped, "anything to save him." By dawn, her son's fever had broken completely, but the price Martha paid wasn't immediately apparent. It began with dreams, vivid nightmares where shadowy figures taught her rituals she'd never seen, words and languages that predated human speech. She found herself waking with detailed knowledge of herbs that could kill or cure, of ceremonies that could bind human souls, of ways to call upon the ancient hunger that lived in the deep places of the earth. Within months, Martha had gathered a small group of desperate followers, widows whose husbands had died in mine collapses, farmers whose crops had failed, anyone who had lost everything and found themselves with nowhere else to turn. She promised them power, prosperity, and protection from the harsh realities of mountain life. All they had to do was participate in monthly ceremonies at the grove, ceremonies that grew increasingly dark as the seasons passed. The early rituals were relatively harmless, involving animal sacrifices and blood offerings that seemed to bring genuine results. Members reported miraculous healings, unprecedented harvests, and protection from the accidents and diseases that plagued their neighbors. But the entity Martha had awakened demanded more as its influence grew. The monthly animal sacrifices became weekly, then nightly. Members were required to bring not just their own blood, but that of their children, their spouses, anyone they could convince to join their growing congregation. By 1905, the blood covenant had evolved into something that bore no resemblance to any traditional religion. They practiced what they called the Crimson Sacrament, a ritual where members would drink mixtures of human blood and mountain herbs that induced vivid hallucinations and claimed to grant supernatural abilities. Children born into the cult were subjected to bloodletting ceremonies from infancy, their blood mixed with that of previous generations in an unholy communion that supposedly connected them to the ancient entity beneath Pine Ridge. The cult's influence spread through a network of seemingly normal families across eastern Kentucky. Members identified each other through subtle signs, a specific way of greeting, small scars on their palms from ritual bloodletting, and an uncanny ability to predict deaths and disasters before they occurred. They infiltrated local government, law enforcement, and even churches, creating a shadow network that protected their activities from outside scrutiny. What made the Blood Covenant particularly dangerous was their practice of targeted recruitment. They specifically sought out individuals who had suffered recent tragedies, offering comfort and community to those who had lost everything. New members were slowly indoctrinated through a careful process that began with minor favors and gradually escalated to participation in increasingly disturbing rituals. By the time recruits realized the true nature of what they'd joined, they were already too deeply involved to escape. The cult's downfall began in 1918 when a traveling preacher named Reverend Samuel Cross arrived in the region. Cross had spent years studying occult practices and immediately recognized the signs of supernatural influence in the area. He noticed the unusual number of unexplained deaths, the way certain families seemed to prosper while others suffered, and the strange symbols that appeared carved into trees and buildings throughout the region. Cross began his own investigation, documenting the cult's activities and gathering testimony from former members who had managed to escape. What he discovered horrified even him. The Blood Covenant wasn't just practicing ritual sacrifice, they were attempting to physically manifest the entity they served. Members reported seeing something moving beneath the altar at Pine Ridge, something that was slowly clawing its way toward the surface with each ceremony performed. The Reverend's investigation came to an abrupt end when he disappeared while hiking alone near Pine Ridge. His body was never found, but his journal survived, hidden in the floorboards of his temporary lodging. The final entry, dated 3 days before his disappearance, described his intention to confront the cult directly and attempt to destroy whatever they had awakened beneath the grove. Federal authorities finally became involved in 1925 when a series of child disappearances in the region couldn't be explained by conventional means. The investigation revealed evidence of the cult's activities, including detailed records of rituals and a membership list that included prominent local officials. However, by the time agents arrived to make arrests, they found the Pine Ridge Grove had been abandoned. The stone altar had been shattered, and the surrounding trees bore fresh burn marks, as if something had erupted from the earth itself. Most disturbing of all, they discovered a network of tunnels beneath the grove, hand-carved passages that extended deep into the mountain. These tunnels contained evidence of prolonged human habitation, including sleeping areas, storage chambers, and what appeared to be a primitive laboratory where human remains had been subjected to unknown procedures. The tunnels eventually led to a vast underground chamber where investigators found the remains of dozens of individuals arranged in concentric circles around a massive pit that descended beyond the reach of their lights. The official report classified the Blood Covenant as a criminal organization involved in kidnapping and murder, but investigators privately acknowledged that conventional explanations couldn't account for everything they'd discovered. Several agents reported experiencing vivid nightmares after visiting the site, dreams that featured the same shadowy figures and ancient symbols that appeared in Martha Hensley's original testimony. The cult's surviving members scattered across the Appalachian region, but their influence didn't end with the destruction of Pine Ridge. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, law enforcement agencies across multiple states reported similar cases involving ritual sacrifice and blood-based ceremonies. These incidents shared common elements: the use of specific symbols, the targeting of vulnerable individuals, and the presence of underground chambers or hidden groves where ceremonies were conducted. Modern investigators believe the blood covenant represented a particularly virulent strain of occult practice that may have originated with pre-Columbian indigenous rituals. The entity they served, whatever its true nature, appears to have been something that required regular feeding to maintain its influence in the physical world. The cult's practices may have been an attempt to gradually weaken the barriers between dimensions, allowing this entity to manifest more fully in our reality. Recent developments have renewed interest in the blood covenant's legacy. In 2019, construction workers building a new highway through eastern Kentucky discovered a sealed chamber containing artifacts that match descriptions from the original investigation. The chamber held dozens of glass vials containing preserved biological samples, detailed anatomical drawings, and journals written in the same unknown language that appeared in Martha Hensley's later writings. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of recent additions to the chamber. Some of the journals contained entries dated as recently as 2015, suggesting that descendants of the original cult members continue to practice modified versions of the blood covenant's rituals. These modern practitioners appear to have adapted their methods to contemporary life, using social media and online platforms to identify and recruit vulnerable individuals. The third cult in our examination emerged from the coal mining regions of West Virginia in 1923, where industrial accidents and economic desperation created perfect conditions for supernatural exploitation. The Covenant of Ash began when a catastrophic mine explosion trapped 47 miners beneath Skull Mountain. What happened during the 6 days before rescue crews reached the survivors would spawn a religious movement that made the Blood Covenant look like a children's Sunday school class. Only 13 miners survived the initial explosion, trapped in a small chamber with no food, no water, and rapidly diminishing air. As the days passed and rescue attempts failed, the survivors began to experience shared hallucinations. They reported seeing figures moving in the darkness beyond their makeshift shelter, hearing voices that spoke in languages that predated human civilization, and feeling an overwhelming presence that seemed to emanate from the deepest parts of the mountain itself. The miners' leader, a man named Ezra Blackwood, claimed to have established communication with this presence. According to survivor testimony, Blackwood said the entity offered them a choice. They could die slowly in the darkness, or they could accept its protection and emerge as its servants. The decision was unanimous, driven by desperation and the increasing certainty that conventional rescue efforts would fail. What happened next defied all rational explanation. The survivors reported that the chamber began to expand, walls shifting and moving as if the mountain itself was reshaping its internal structure. New passages appeared, leading to underground rivers and vast caverns that shouldn't have existed according to geological surveys. Most importantly, they found air to breathe and strange, phosphorescent fungi that provided both light and sustenance. When rescue crews finally reached the disaster site, they found all 13 survivors alive and in remarkably good health. However, the men who emerged from Skull Mountain were fundamentally changed. They spoke in unison when questioned, their voices carrying an otherworldly resonance that made listeners deeply uncomfortable. Their eyes had developed an unusual silvery sheen, and they seemed to possess knowledge of events occurring in distant locations. The survivors' families initially welcomed them home, grateful for what seemed like a miraculous rescue. But it quickly became apparent that these men were no longer entirely human. They required no sleep, consumed only water and a strange gray substance they claimed to harvest from the mountain, and displayed strength and endurance that exceeded normal human limits. More disturbing was their apparent ability to communicate with each other across vast distances, sharing thoughts and experiences as if they were parts of a single collective consciousness. Within months, the 13 survivors had established a new religious movement centered around what they called the Deep Covenant. They preached that humanity was merely a temporary phase in a greater evolutionary process, that the earth itself was a living entity preparing for a transformation that would remake all life on its surface. Their message resonated with coal miners and industrial workers who had witnessed firsthand the devastating effects of environmental destruction and economic exploitation. The Covenant of Ash grew rapidly, attracting followers throughout the coal mining regions of West Virginia and Pennsylvania. Members were required to undergo an initiation ceremony that involved descending into abandoned mine shafts and spending 3 days in complete darkness while fasting and meditating. Those who completed this ordeal reported profound spiritual experiences, claiming to have made contact with the same entity that had saved the original 13 survivors. The cult's practices became increasingly extreme as their numbers grew. They established communes in remote mountain areas, living in conditions that deliberately mimicked the underground environment where their movement had originated. Members slept in underground chambers, ate only the gray fungal substance they cultivated in artificial caves, and spent hours each day in meditation, designed to merge their consciousness with what they called the deep mind. Children born into the cult were subjected to modifications that began in infancy. They were kept in underground nurseries, exposed to minimal natural light, and fed diets designed to enhance their adaptation to subterranean life. These children developed enlarged eyes, enhanced hearing, and skin that was unusually pale and sensitive to sunlight. By adolescence, they displayed the same collective consciousness exhibited by the original 13 survivors. The Covenant's influence extended beyond their immediate membership through a network of sympathizers in mining communities. They provided financial support to families affected by industrial accidents, offered medical care through practitioners who claimed to use ancient healing techniques, and gradually built a power base that included local politicians and business leaders. Their message of environmental transformation and human evolution appealed to those who had witnessed the devastating effects of industrialization on the natural world. Federal attention was drawn to the cult in 1941 when a series of mining accidents occurred under suspicious circumstances. Investigators discovered that several mines had been deliberately sabotaged, their support structures weakened to cause controlled collapses. The Covenant claimed responsibility for these incidents, stating that they were accelerating the process of returning the Earth to its natural state by eliminating what they saw as destructive human activities. The government's response was swift and brutal. Military forces surrounded the cult's primary compound in the mountains of West Virginia, demanding the surrender of all members. The siege lasted for 3 weeks, during which time negotiators reported increasingly bizarre communications from within the compound. Cult members claimed that their underground chambers extended far deeper than surface observations suggested, that they had access to resources and allies that government forces couldn't comprehend. The siege ended when military forces breached the compound's defenses, only to discover that it was completely empty. Despite continuous surveillance, over 300 cult members had somehow vanished without a trace. The underground chambers were found to be far more extensive than external surveys had indicated, with passages that led deep into the mountain's interior. Most disturbing of all, these passages showed signs of recent expansion, as if the mountain itself was actively creating new spaces for the cult's use. The investigation revealed evidence of the cult's true ambitions. Documents found in the abandoned compound described plans for a systematic campaign to collapse industrial infrastructure across the eastern United States. The Covenant believed that by destroying enough mines, factories, and power plants, they could trigger an economic collapse that would force humanity to abandon technological civilization and return to what they saw as a more natural way of life. More chilling were the biological samples discovered in the cult's underground laboratories. They had been conducting experiments on both human and animal subjects, attempting to accelerate the evolutionary adaptations they believed necessary for life in their envisioned post-industrial world. The modifications they were developing included enhanced abilities to survive in low oxygen environments, resistance to various toxins, and the collective consciousness that characterized their leadership. The fate of the Covenant of Ash remained unknown until 1967, when a team of geological surveyors exploring abandoned mine shafts in West Virginia made a disturbing discovery. They found evidence of recent human habitation in chambers that extended far beyond the mapped boundaries of the original mines. The chambers contained sophisticated equipment for air purification, water processing, and food production, suggesting that a substantial population had been living underground for decades. Most alarming was the discovery of what appeared to be a breeding program designed to create humans specifically adapted for subterranean life. The surveyors found nurseries containing dozens of infants and young children, all displaying the physical modifications that had characterized the cult's second generation. These children were being raised in complete isolation from the surface world, educated through methods that emphasized collective thinking and absolute obedience to the deep mind. The surveyor's report was immediately classified, and the discovered chambers were sealed with concrete and steel barriers. However, seismic monitoring equipment in the region continued to detect unusual activity, suggesting ongoing expansion of the underground network. Government officials privately acknowledged that the Covenant of Ash might represent a parallel human society that had successfully adapted to life beneath the Earth's surface. Recent evidence suggests that the cult's influence may be spreading beyond their original territory. Environmental monitoring stations across the Appalachian region have detected unusual chemical signatures in groundwater that match compounds found in the cult's abandoned laboratories. These findings suggest that the Covenant may be continuing their experiments on a much larger scale, potentially affecting entire watersheds and ecosystems. The fourth cult we must examine represents perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated of all Appalachian occult movements. The Order of the Eternal Flame emerged in the mountains of North Carolina in 1934, founded by a charismatic leader who understood that the most effective way to control people wasn't through fear or superstition, but through the systematic manipulation of their deepest psychological needs and desires. Marcus Thorne arrived in the Blue Ridge Mountains with impeccable credentials: a doctorate in psychology from Harvard, extensive study of religious movements across multiple cultures, and a personal magnetism that made him instantly compelling to anyone who met him. He established what he called the Institute for Spiritual Development, ostensibly a retreat center where individuals could explore their inner nature through guided meditation and psychological therapy. Thorne's approach was revolutionary for its time. He combined cutting-edge psychological techniques with carefully selected elements from various mystical traditions, creating a system that promised not just spiritual enlightenment, but actual transformation of human consciousness. His methods attracted intellectuals, artists, and wealthy individuals seeking meaning beyond conventional religion or materialistic success. The Institute's programs began innocuously enough. Participants underwent intensive psychological evaluation, followed by personalized treatment plans designed to address their specific emotional and spiritual needs. Thorne claimed to have developed techniques that could unlock hidden human potential, allowing individuals to access abilities that conventional science insisted were impossible. What made Thorne's methods so effective was his understanding of psychological vulnerability. He carefully studied each participant's background, identifying their deepest fears, unfulfilled desires, and emotional wounds. The initial stages of treatment involved legitimate therapeutic techniques that produced genuine improvements in participants' mental health and self-confidence. This success created a foundation of trust that Thorne would later exploit for far darker purposes. As participants progressed through the Institute's programs, they were gradually introduced to more esoteric practices. Advanced students learned meditation techniques that involved prolonged sensory deprivation, breathing exercises that induced altered states of consciousness, and visualization methods that supposedly allowed direct communication with higher spiritual beings. These practices were presented as natural extensions of the psychological work they had already begun. The Order of the Eternal Flame's true nature emerged only after participants had been thoroughly conditioned through months or years of preparation. Advanced members were told that they had been chosen to participate in humanity's next evolutionary leap, that their psychological development had prepared them to serve as vessels for beings of pure consciousness who existed on higher dimensional planes. The rituals that followed were sophisticated psychological operations designed to completely break down participants' sense of individual identity. Members were subjected to extended periods of isolation, sleep deprivation, and sensory manipulation while being bombarded with complex ideological programming. They were taught that their previous lives had been illusions, that their memories and personalities were artificial constructs that prevented them from accessing their true nature. Thorne's ultimate goal was the creation of what he called the collective consciousness, a group mind that would transcend individual human limitations and serve as a bridge between humanity and the higher beings he claimed to represent. Members who successfully completed the transformation process displayed the same loss of individual identity that characterized other Appalachian cults, but with a crucial difference. They retained their intellectual capabilities and professional skills, making them far more effective at infiltrating and manipulating conventional society. The order's influence spread through a network of seemingly legitimate organizations. Members established psychological practices, educational institutions, and spiritual centers throughout the southeastern United States. They used their positions to identify and recruit new candidates, always targeting individuals who possessed either significant wealth, professional influence, or exceptional intellectual abilities. Unlike other cults that isolated their members from the outside world, the order encouraged its followers to maintain their conventional lives while secretly working to advance the organization's agenda. They infiltrated government agencies, academic institutions, and major corporations, creating a shadow network that operated according to principles radically different from those of normal human society. The order's practices became increasingly disturbing as their influence grew. They began conducting experiments on human consciousness that went far beyond anything attempted by conventional psychology. Members reported being subjected to procedures that involved the deliberate fragmentation of personality, the implantation of false memories, and the systematic destruction of emotional attachments to family and friends. Children born into the order were subjected to treatment that amounted to systematic psychological torture. They were raised in environments designed to prevent the development of normal human emotional responses, educated through methods that emphasized absolute obedience to the collective consciousness, and subjected to procedures that deliberately damaged their ability to form individual relationships or think independently. The order's downfall began in 1953 when a former member named Dr. Patricia Hendricks managed to escape and contact federal authorities. Hendricks had been a respected psychiatrist before joining the order, and her detailed testimony about the organization's practices shocked investigators. She provided evidence that the order had been conducting illegal human experimentation, financial fraud, and systematic child abuse on a massive scale. The federal investigation revealed that the order had amassed enormous wealth through the manipulation of its members' finances. Participants were required to donate their entire assets to the organization, which then used these resources to fund expansion and political influence. The order had established connections with organized crime syndicates, foreign intelligence agencies, and various extremist political movements. Most disturbing were the order's plans for large-scale social manipulation. Documents recovered from their facilities described detailed strategies for infiltrating democratic institutions, manipulating public opinion through media control, and gradually reshaping society according to their vision of collective consciousness. They had been working toward what they called the Great Transformation, a systematic campaign to destroy individual human identity and replace it with their artificial group mind. The government's response to the order was unprecedented in its scope and secrecy. Military forces surrounded the Institute's main facility while simultaneous raids were conducted on dozens of affiliated organizations across the country. However, the operation's effectiveness was limited by the fact that many order members had successfully integrated into conventional society and couldn't be easily identified or apprehended. The Order of the Eternal Flame's legacy continues to influence contemporary society in ways that most people never realize. Many of the psychological techniques they developed have been adapted by various organizations, from corporate training programs to political movements. Their methods for manipulating group consciousness and breaking down individual identity have been studied and refined by intelligence agencies and extremist groups worldwide. Recent investigations have uncovered evidence that surviving order members may have established new organizations that continue their work under different names. These groups typically present themselves as legitimate psychological research institutes, spiritual development centers, or educational organizations, but they employ the same sophisticated manipulation techniques that characterized the original order. The fifth cult in our examination represents the most recent and perhaps most dangerous development in Appalachian occultism. The Children of the Deep Wood emerged in the 1960s during a period of social upheaval and environmental crisis, combining traditional mountain folklore with modern environmental extremism to create a movement that threatens not just individual lives, but the stability of entire ecosystems. The cult's origins can be traced to a series of environmental disasters that devastated the Appalachian region during the 1960s. Strip mining operations had destroyed thousands of acres of forest, chemical runoff had poisoned rivers and streams, and industrial development had driven many native species to the brink of extinction. Against this backdrop of ecological destruction, a mysterious figure known only as the Forest Father began attracting followers who shared his vision of radical environmental restoration. The Forest Father's true identity remains unknown, but his knowledge of both ancient Celtic folklore and modern ecological science was extraordinary. He preached that the natural world was engaged in a war against human civilization, that the earth itself was developing new forms of life, specifically designed to resist and ultimately eliminate human influence. His followers believed that by aligning themselves with these natural forces, they could survive the coming ecological apocalypse and help create a new world order based on harmony between humanity and nature. The Children of the Deep Wood established communes in the most remote areas of the Appalachian Mountains, living in conditions that deliberately mimicked pre-industrial lifestyles. However, their practices went far beyond simple environmental activism. They believed that human consciousness itself was a form of pollution that needed to be purified through direct communion with the natural world. The cult's initiation rituals involved extended periods of isolation in the wilderness, during which candidates were expected to survive using only primitive tools and techniques. Those who successfully completed these trials reported profound spiritual experiences, claiming to have established telepathic communication with trees, animals, and even the forest ecosystem itself. They described achieving a state of consciousness that transcended individual human identity, becoming part of a larger collective intelligence that encompassed all living things. As the cult grew, their methods became increasingly extreme. They began conducting raids on industrial facilities, using techniques that combined traditional guerrilla warfare with what they claimed were supernatural abilities gained through their communion with nature. Members reported being able to move through forests without leaving tracks, to communicate with wild animals, and to sense the presence of humans from great distances. The Children of the Deep Woods' most disturbing practice involved the systematic modification of human biology through exposure to various plant and fungal compounds found in the deep forest. They believed that by consuming these substances over extended periods, they could trigger evolutionary changes that would allow humans to survive in a post-industrial world. Children born into the cult were subjected to these treatments from birth, developing unusual physical characteristics and displaying behavior that seemed more animal than human. The cult's influence spread through a network of environmental activists, back to the land communes, and indigenous rights organizations. They provided financial support and tactical training to various eco-terrorist groups, helping to coordinate attacks on industrial facilities across the eastern United States. Their ultimate goal was the complete collapse of technological civilization and the return of North America to its pre-Columbian state. Federal authorities became aware of the Children of the Deep Wood in 1972 when a series of coordinated attacks on strip mining operations resulted in millions of dollars in damage and several deaths. The attacks were carried out with a level of coordination and tactical sophistication that suggested military training, but investigators found no evidence of conventional organizational structure or communication methods. The cult's influence continues to grow, adapting to contemporary environmental concerns while maintaining their core belief in the necessity of human transformation. They have established connections with various radical environmental groups, indigenous sovereignty movements, and anti-technology organizations, creating a network that spans multiple continents and ideologies. As we examine these 5 cults, a disturbing pattern emerges. Each group, despite their different origins and practices, shared certain common characteristics. They arose during periods of social and economic crisis. They promised solutions to problems that conventional society couldn't address, and they gradually transformed their members into something that was no longer entirely human. Most troubling of all, they seem to have been connected by hidden networks that allowed them to share information, resources, and techniques across vast distances and decades of time. The evidence suggests that these cults weren't isolated phenomena, but part of a larger pattern of supernatural influence that has been shaping human development in the Appalachian region for generations. The mountains themselves seem to harbor forces that can manipulate human consciousness, exploit psychological vulnerabilities, and gradually reshape both individual identity and collective behavior according to agendas that remain largely hidden from conventional understanding. These weren't just secret societies hiding in remote cabins. What investigators discovered in the 1990s was evidence of a sophisticated network that had been operating for over a century, connecting all 7 cults through shared symbols, coordinated timing, and most disturbing of all, a systematic exchange of members and knowledge. The Children of the Deep Wood weren't acting alone. They were part of something much larger, much older, and much more dangerous than anyone had imagined. When federal agents raided the primary Deepwood compound in 1994, they found detailed correspondence with the other 6 cults dating back to the 1800s. Letters written in multiple hands, but using identical phrases, identical symbols, identical ritual timings. The evidence suggested these weren't separate groups that had coincidentally developed similar practices. They were branches of the same twisted tree, deliberately planted across Appalachian territory to create a network of influence that stretched from Georgia to Pennsylvania. The coordination was meticulous. When the Order of the Eternal Flame conducted their psychological conditioning experiments, they would share their findings with the Pine Ridge Covenant, who would then incorporate the most effective techniques into their blood rituals. The Covenant of Ash would provide underground safe houses for members fleeing law enforcement, while the Children of the Deep Wood would eliminate anyone who got too close to exposing the network. Each cult specialized in different aspects of the same overarching agenda, creating a system where the whole was infinitely more dangerous than its individual parts. Most chilling was the discovery of what investigators called the registry, a comprehensive database of every person who had ever been touched by any of the 7 cults: names, addresses, family members, psychological profiles, and something called compatibility ratings. The registry wasn't just a record-keeping system, it was a recruitment tool. When someone in a particular region experienced the right combination of desperation, isolation, and psychological vulnerability, they would be contacted by whichever cult was best positioned to exploit their specific weaknesses. The network had been perfecting this system for generations. A farmer facing bankruptcy might be approached by representatives offering the prosperity rituals of Ezekiel Whitmore's group. A grieving parent might find themselves drawn to the Pine Ridge Covenant's promises of communion with the dead. A young person struggling with identity and belonging might be recruited by the Order of the Eternal Flame's sophisticated manipulation techniques. Each cult served as a specialized recruitment and processing center, feeding the most promising candidates up to higher levels of the network. What those higher levels contained remained largely unknown, even after the raids. The 7 cults that had been exposed appeared to be merely the visible layer of something much deeper. References in seized documents spoke of the conclave, a governing body that met annually in a location known only as the Deep Chamber. Members who had reached the highest levels of initiation in any of the 7 cults would be invited to participate in these gatherings, where they would receive instructions for the coming year and contribute to what the documents called the Great Work. The Great Work itself was never fully explained in the recovered materials, but fragments painted a picture of an agenda that extended far beyond the local communities these cults had terrorized. References to bloodline purification, consciousness transfer, environmental manipulation, and something called the convergence suggested goals that were generational in scope. The network wasn't just exploiting isolated mountain communities for power or pleasure. They were conducting a long-term experiment in human evolution, using the isolated populations of Appalachia as test subjects for techniques that would eventually be applied on a much larger scale. Evidence of this broader agenda could be found in the way the network had systematically infiltrated local institutions over the decades. By the 1990s, members or descendants of the 7 cults held positions in county governments, school boards, police departments, and even state agencies across multiple states. They weren't just hiding in remote compounds anymore. They were embedded in the very systems meant to protect people from groups like themselves. The psychological conditioning techniques developed by the Order of the Eternal Flame had been quietly introduced into educational curricula in dozens of rural school districts. The agricultural manipulation methods pioneered by the children of the Deep Wood had influenced farming practices across the region, with certain crops being cultivated not for their nutritional value, but for their psychoactive properties. The underground networks created by the Covenant of Ash had been expanded into a transportation system that could move people, materials, and information across state lines without detection. Most disturbing was the discovery that the network had been conducting what they called generational studies, tracking the descendants of their victims across multiple generations to study the long-term effects of their various experiments. Children whose parents had been killed by the Pine Ridge Covenant decades earlier were being monitored throughout their lives, their psychological development, their career choices, their relationships, even their reproductive decisions being influenced by network operatives. The network's influence extended into the medical field as well. Several rural hospitals and clinics were found to have been infiltrated by network operatives who had been conducting unauthorized medical experiments on patients. Blood samples, tissue samples, and detailed psychological profiles had been collected from thousands of individuals over the decades, all feeding into research programs that seemed designed to identify people with specific genetic or psychological characteristics that made them suitable for recruitment or experimentation. When investigators tried to trace the network's origins, they found evidence suggesting it had been operating in some form since the early 1800s, possibly even earlier. The 7 cults that had been exposed were just the most recent iteration of something that had been evolving and adapting for generations. Earlier versions had operated under different names, using different methods, but always maintaining the same basic structure of specialized cells working toward a common goal. The network's longevity suggested a level of organization and planning that challenged conventional understanding of how such groups typically operate. Most cults are built around charismatic leaders whose death or imprisonment typically causes the group to collapse. But this network had survived the deaths of dozens of leaders over the decades, suggesting an institutional structure that transcended individual personalities. Part of their success came from their approach to recruitment and training. Rather than relying on a single charismatic figure, the network cultivated multiple leaders across different specializations. When one leader was eliminated, others were already in place to take over their functions. They also maintained extensive written records of their techniques and procedures, ensuring that knowledge could be transferred from one generation to the next without depending on oral tradition. The network's financial resources were equally impressive. Through their various criminal enterprises, legitimate businesses, and infiltration of local institutions, they had accumulated substantial wealth over the decades. This financial foundation allowed them to operate independently of outside funding, making them less vulnerable to the kind of financial pressure that typically brings down criminal organizations. Their technological adaptation was perhaps most impressive. While maintaining their traditional ritual practices, the network had embraced modern technology when it served their purposes. They used encrypted communications, sophisticated surveillance equipment, and even early computer systems to coordinate their activities and maintain their databases. By the 1990s, they were operating with a level of technological sophistication that rivaled many legitimate organizations. The network's influence on popular culture was subtle but pervasive. Over the decades, they had successfully promoted certain narratives about Appalachian culture that served their interests. The stereotypes of backwards mountain people, the romanticization of isolation and self reliance, the portrayal of mountain communities as places where outside authority had no jurisdiction, all of these cultural narratives made it easier for the network to operate without scrutiny. They had also influenced academic and journalistic coverage of the region, ensuring that researchers and reporters who got too close to the truth would find their work discredited or their funding eliminated. Several historians and journalists who had been investigating unusual patterns in Appalachian history had mysteriously abandoned their research projects, often citing family pressures or career concerns that appeared shortly after they began asking the right questions. The network's approach to law enforcement was equally sophisticated. Rather than simply avoiding or confronting authorities, they had developed strategies for managing and manipulating law enforcement responses. They maintained detailed profiles of individual officers, judges, and prosecutors, identifying those who could be bribed, blackmailed, or otherwise influenced. They also had contingency plans for dealing with incorruptible officials, ranging from character assassination to more direct methods of elimination. When the federal raids finally came in the mid 1990s, the network's response revealed just how deeply they had penetrated the system. Within hours of the first arrests, evidence began disappearing from storage facilities. Witnesses started recanting their testimony, and key investigators found themselves reassigned to other cases. The prosecutions that did move forward were hampered by missing evidence, uncooperative witnesses, and legal challenges that seemed to anticipate the government's strategy. Most of the network's leadership vanished before they could be arrested, suggesting they had been warned well in advance of the raids. Those who were captured were mostly lower-level operatives who had limited knowledge of the network's broader operations. The few high-ranking members who were prosecuted received surprisingly light sentences, often due to plea bargains that were negotiated behind closed doors. The network's ability to survive and adapt was demonstrated in the aftermath of the raids. Within months of the supposed dismantling of the 7 cults, new groups with similar practices began appearing in other regions. The names and symbols were different, but the underlying structure and methodology remained consistent. The network had simply shed its compromised components and regenerated elsewhere. By the early 2000s, investigators were tracking what appeared to be a new generation of network operations, now expanded beyond Appalachia into other rural and isolated regions across the country. The techniques that had been perfected in the mountains of Kentucky and West Virginia were being applied in the deserts of Nevada, the forests of the Pacific Northwest, and the plains of the Midwest. The network's evolution continued into the digital age. While maintaining their traditional practices, they embraced internet technology for recruitment, communication, and coordination. Online forums, social media platforms, and encrypted messaging systems became new tools for identifying potential recruits and coordinating activities across vast distances. The original 7 cults had been merely the beginning. What investigators discovered in the 1990s was evidence of a network that had been using Appalachian isolation as a testing ground for techniques that would eventually be applied on a national scale. The mountains had provided the perfect laboratory for experimenting with psychological manipulation, social control, and human modification techniques that could later be deployed in more populated areas. The network's ultimate goals remained largely unknown, but the evidence suggested they were working towards something far more ambitious than simple criminal enterprise or religious extremism. The combination of psychological conditioning, genetic manipulation, environmental control, and social infiltration suggested a long-term plan to fundamentally alter human society in ways that served their vision of how the world should be organized. What made the network particularly dangerous was their patience and their willingness to work across generations. Unlike terrorist groups or criminal organizations that sought immediate results, the network was content to work slowly, building their influence gradually over decades. They understood that real change happened gradually, and they were willing to invest the time necessary to achieve their goals. The 7 deadly cults of Appalachia had been just the visible tip of something much larger and more dangerous. They had served as recruitment centers, training grounds, and testing facilities for a network that had been quietly working to reshape American society from within. The mountains had hidden their activities for over a century, but their influence had spread far beyond the isolated hollows where they had first taken root. The network's story was far from over. The raids of the 1990s had been merely a temporary setback, forcing them to adapt and evolve their methods. The fundamental structure remained intact, the leadership had survived, and the long-term goals remained unchanged. The mountains still held their secrets, and the network continued its work in the shadows, patient and persistent in pursuit of goals that remained hidden from public view. As we continue our descent into the shadowy depths of Appalachian cult history, we must now confront the most chilling revelation of all. The 7 families we've examined were not isolated incidents, random pockets of darkness scattered across the mountains. They were part of something far more sinister, far more organized than anyone could have imagined. What we're about to uncover will shake your understanding of how these cults operated, how they survived, and most terrifyingly, how they continue to influence our world today. The evidence points to an intricate web of connections spanning over a century, a network so sophisticated that it defies everything we thought we knew about these isolated mountain communities. Federal investigators who stumbled upon fragments of this conspiracy found themselves reassigned, their files mysteriously sealed, their testimonies buried beneath layers of bureaucratic red tape. What they discovered was not just a collection of dangerous families, but a coordinated system of power, knowledge, and influence that reached far beyond the misty hollows of Appalachia. The first hint of this broader conspiracy emerged in 1962 when a fire at the Whitmore County Courthouse exposed a hidden archive. Among the charred documents, investigators found correspondence between the various cult families, letters written in coded language that spoke of gatherings, shared rituals, and something they called the Great Work. These weren't isolated fanatics, stumbling through primitive superstitions. These were organized groups following a carefully orchestrated plan that had been developing for generations. The correspondence revealed a hierarchy within the network, with certain families serving as regional coordinators, while others functioned as specialized cells. The Thornton family, with their mining operations, served as the financial backbone, funneling resources to other groups through a complex system of shell companies and land transfers. The Whitaker musicians weren't just performers, they were messengers, carrying coded compositions between settlements, their haunting melodies actually containing instructions and updates for the network. Each family had developed specific expertise that served the greater organization. The Lowell healers weren't just treating illnesses, they were conducting biological experiments, testing the limits of human endurance and transformation. Their detailed medical records, written in that peculiar cipher, documented attempts to enhance human capabilities through ritualistic procedures. The Carver timber operations weren't just harvesting wood, they were clearing specific areas for ceremonial sites, creating a network of sacred groves connected by ancient pathways that predated European settlement. The most disturbing discovery was the evidence of recruitment and expansion. The families weren't content to remain isolated in their mountain strongholds. They actively sought new members, particularly targeting individuals with specific bloodlines, unusual abilities, or psychological profiles that made them susceptible to their influence. Missing persons reports from across the eastern United States revealed a pattern of disappearances that aligned suspiciously with the family's territorial expansions. Government documents, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests decades later, revealed that federal agencies had been aware of these activities since the 1920s. The Bureau of Investigation, precursor to the FBI, had compiled extensive files on what they termed Appalachian anomalous organizations. These files detailed coordinated raids, mysterious deaths of federal agents, and phenomena that defied conventional explanation. One particularly chilling report described an entire investigation team found catatonic in a West Virginia forest, their memories completely wiped, speaking only in the strange dialect that seemed common to all the cult families. The network's sophistication became apparent through their use of symbols and communication methods. Archaeological surveys conducted in the 1970s revealed that many of the family's properties contained identical carved symbols, not just on buildings, but carved into living trees, etched into rock faces, and even branded into the landscape itself. These symbols formed a vast communication network spanning hundreds of miles, allowing the families to coordinate their activities across state lines. More troubling was the evidence of their influence on legitimate institutions. Bank records showed unexplained loans to struggling businesses, always with unusual terms buried in the fine print. Political campaigns received anonymous donations that could be traced back to the family's various enterprises. Local newspapers carried stories that seemed designed to discourage investigation into certain areas, painting them as dangerous wilderness, unsuitable for development or exploration. The families had also infiltrated academic institutions, funding anthropological studies that consistently concluded their practices were mere folklore, harmless mountain superstitions blown out of proportion by ignorant outsiders. Professors who attempted to publish contrary findings found their research defunded, their careers derailed, their evidence mysteriously disappearing from university archives. The technological age brought new opportunities for the network's expansion. Computer records from the 1980s revealed that several major corporations had been influenced by individuals with connections to the families. Defense contractors, pharmaceutical companies, and technology firms all showed patterns of hiring and promotion that suggested systematic infiltration. The families had evolved from isolated mountain cults to a shadow organization with tendrils reaching into the highest levels of American society. Their ultimate goals remained unclear, but fragments of their internal communications suggested something they called the convergence, a long-term plan involving the transformation of human consciousness on a global scale. They spoke of preparing humanity for contact with what they termed the Ancient Ones, entities that had supposedly guided their practices for centuries. Their rituals weren't just about personal power or local control. They were part of a preparation process for something far greater and more terrifying. The evidence of their modern activities is both subtle and pervasive. Social media algorithms that seem designed to promote certain types of content, streaming services that mysteriously add specific films and music to users' recommendations, news stories that subtly shift public opinion toward acceptance of ideas that would have been considered fringe decades ago. The families had learned to work within modern systems, using technology and media to spread their influence more effectively than they ever could through direct recruitment. Urban legends from major cities began incorporating elements that seemed lifted directly from Appalachian cult practices. Young people in metropolitan areas reported dreams featuring mountain landscapes they'd never seen, spoke of feeling drawn to wilderness areas for reasons they couldn't explain, and developed interests in occult practices that bore striking similarities to the family's rituals. Mental health professionals noted a disturbing trend in the 1990s and 2000s, patients presenting with shared delusions involving mountain imagery, ancient symbols, and the sensation of being watched by unseen entities. These cases occurred across the country in cities far removed from Appalachian influence, yet the consistency of the reported experiences suggested something more than mere coincidence. The family's influence on popular culture became increasingly apparent to those who knew what to look for. Movies, television shows, and music began incorporating specific symbols and themes that had previously been confined to their isolated mountain communities. Horror films featured creatures and scenarios that seemed lifted directly from their practices. Musicians reported receiving inspiration for songs and dreams, compositions that bore striking resemblances to the coded melodies used by the Whitaker family. Environmental groups found themselves mysteriously funded to protect certain wilderness areas, always locations that happened to contain sites significant to the family's network. Conservation efforts that seemed altruistic on the surface served the dual purpose of keeping these areas free from development and investigation, preserving the family's sacred sites for future use. The COVID-19 pandemic provided new opportunities for the network's expansion, with people isolated, spending more time online, and seeking alternative explanations for global events. The family's influence spread through digital channels with unprecedented speed. Conspiracy theories that contained elements of their belief systems gained traction, preparing minds for concepts that would have been rejected outright in previous generations. Law enforcement agencies began noticing patterns in missing persons cases that suggested organized activity rather than random disappearances. Individuals with specific psychological profiles, bloodlines, or skill sets vanished under circumstances that left no trace, no digital footprint, no witnesses. The disappearances occurred in clusters around dates significant to the family's ritual calendar, suggesting their recruitment activities had not only continued but intensified. The network's ultimate goal appears to be nothing less than the fundamental transformation of human society. Their century-long infiltration of institutions, their careful cultivation of influence, and their patient preparation of the collective consciousness all point toward a moment they call the Great Awakening. When that moment arrives, when humanity has been sufficiently prepared, the ancient ones will emerge from their mountain strongholds to reclaim a world that has been systematically prepared for their return. The evidence is overwhelming, the patterns undeniable, yet the mainstream world remains largely unaware of the shadow network that has been shaping human civilization for over a century. The family's greatest achievement may be their ability to hide in plain sight, to operate so subtly that their influence appears to be natural evolution rather than deliberate manipulation. As we stand at the threshold of understanding the true scope of their operations, we must ask ourselves a chilling question. If these 7 families represent merely the visible tip of an iceberg, what lies beneath the surface? How many other families, other networks, other ancient powers have been working in the shadows, patiently preparing for a future that may be far closer than any of us realize? The mountains keep their secrets, but the secrets are spreading. The influence that once required physical presence in remote hollows now travels through fiber optic cables and satellite signals. The ancient ones that once dwelt only in the deepest caves and darkest forests now walk among us, in forms we don't recognize, preparing for a revelation that will change everything we thought we knew about the nature of reality itself. The convergence accelerated in ways that even the most prepared couldn't have anticipated. By the early 2000s, what had begun as isolated mountain cults operating in shadow had evolved into something far more sophisticated and terrifying. The 7 bloodlines weren't just maintaining ancient traditions anymore. They were actively reshaping modern society through a network so intricate that most of their victims never realized they were being manipulated at all. The digital revolution became their greatest weapon. While the rest of the world celebrated the dawn of the internet age, the 7 families saw an opportunity to expand their influence beyond the mountain hollows that had contained them for generations. They understood something that Silicon Valley's brightest minds missed entirely. Technology wasn't just about connecting people, it was about controlling them. Sarah Chen was a forensic digital analyst for the FBI when she first encountered what she would later call the Appalachian Web. In 2003, while investigating a series of coordinated cyber attacks on environmental protection databases, she discovered something that shouldn't have existed. Hidden within the code of seemingly unrelated websites were symbols that matched those found at cult sites dating back to the 1800s. But these weren't just random occurrences. They were breadcrumbs leading to a digital infrastructure that spanned continents. The symbols weren't decorative, they were functional. Each one served as a node in a communication network that allowed the 7 families to coordinate activities across vast distances without ever using traditional channels that law enforcement could monitor. A small mark embedded in a nature photography website in Colorado could trigger actions in a pharmaceutical company in Switzerland. A pattern hidden in a social media algorithm could influence the mood and behavior of millions of users without their knowledge. What made Sarah's discovery even more disturbing was the sophistication of the operation. This wasn't some backwoods conspiracy using outdated technology. The 7 families had recruited some of the brightest minds in computer science, mathematics, and psychology. Many of these recruits had no idea they were working for a centuries-old cult network. They thought they were building the future. Instead, they were constructing a digital prison for human consciousness. The recruitment process was masterful in its subtlety. Promising students at top universities would receive scholarships from foundations with innocuous names. The funding came with mentorship programs that gradually introduced recipients to increasingly esoteric concepts. By the time these brilliant young minds realized what they were truly working on, they were either too deeply compromised to escape or too fascinated by the possibilities to want to leave. Dr. Marcus Holloway was one of the few who managed to break free. A former MIT professor who had spent 3 years developing what he thought was advanced social media optimization software. He discovered that his algorithms were being used to identify and psychologically profile potential cult recruits. The software could scan millions of social media posts, identifying individuals who exhibited the psychological markers that made them susceptible to cult indoctrination. Depression, isolation, spiritual seeking, family trauma, financial desperation. The algorithm flagged these people with surgical precision, but the technology went far beyond recruitment. The 7 families had developed what they called the influence engine. By subtly manipulating the information that appeared in people's social media feeds, search results, and even the ads they saw, they could gradually shift public opinion on virtually any topic. Environmental protection policies that threatened their operations would suddenly face grassroots opposition that seemed to emerge from nowhere. Politicians who got too close to exposing their activities would find themselves embroiled in scandals that destroyed their credibility. The most chilling aspect was how they used the technology to identify and eliminate threats. Sarah Chen's investigation had made her a target, though she didn't realize it until it was almost too late. The digital stalking began subtly. Her credit cards would be declined at random times. Her emails would disappear or arrive delayed. Her GPS would malfunction, leading her to dangerous neighborhoods. Her social media accounts would be flooded with disturbing content that made her friends and colleagues question her mental stability. The psychological warfare was designed to make targets doubt their own sanity. Sarah began experiencing what she initially thought were panic attacks. She would wake up with inexplicable cuts on her arms. Her apartment would be subtly rearranged while she was away. Photos would appear on her phone that she didn't remember taking. The gaslighting was so sophisticated that she began questioning whether she was suffering from some form of dissociative disorder. It was only when she discovered the hidden cameras and listening devices throughout her apartment that she realized the extent of the surveillance. But by then, the 7 families had already begun the final phase of their psychological assault. They had compiled detailed psychological profiles of her deepest fears and traumas. They knew about her childhood abuse, her struggles with addiction, her failed relationships, and they weaponized every vulnerability against her. The breakthrough came when Sarah realized that the attacks weren't random. They followed the same lunar cycles that the mountain cults had used for their rituals. The 7 families were applying ancient psychological manipulation techniques through modern technology. They understood that human consciousness was far more malleable than most people realized, and they had spent centuries perfecting methods to exploit that malleability. Working with a small team of trusted colleagues, Sarah began mapping the full extent of the digital network. What they discovered was a parallel internet existing alongside the visible web. Hidden servers buried in abandoned mines throughout Appalachia housed databases containing detailed files on millions of individuals. The information went far beyond what any government agency had ever attempted to collect. Medical records, psychological evaluations, family histories, financial data, sexual preferences, spiritual beliefs, deepest fears, and secret shames. Everything needed to control or destroy a person's life. The servers were protected by more than just encryption. Each facility was surrounded by the same protective rituals that had guarded the mountain compounds for generations. Security personnel reported equipment malfunctions, unexplained illnesses, and psychological breakdowns when they attempted to breach the sites. Several investigators who got too close to the servers experienced what could only be described as supernatural phenomena. Electronic devices would spontaneously malfunction. Compasses would spin wildly. Temperature readings would fluctuate impossibly. But the most disturbing discovery was the extent to which the 7 families had infiltrated legitimate institutions. Major technology companies, government agencies, research universities, and media corporations all had high-level employees who were either cult members or unwitting assets. The network had achieved something that no intelligence agency had ever accomplished. They had created a shadow system of control that operated within and alongside legitimate society. The recruitment of children was perhaps the most heinous aspect of the modern operation. The families had identified ways to use online gaming platforms and social media to identify vulnerable young people. Sophisticated AI systems would engage these children in conversations that seemed normal but were actually designed to gradually isolate them from their families and communities. The children would be encouraged to rebel against their parents' values, to embrace increasingly extreme ideologies, and eventually to consider running away from home. When these children disappeared, the investigations would be subtly sabotaged, evidence would be lost, witnesses would recant their statements, the missing person cases would be buried in bureaucratic delays until the trail went cold. The children themselves would be transported to facilities hidden throughout the Appalachian region, where they would undergo the same psychological conditioning that had been used for generations, but enhanced with modern pharmaceutical and technological methods. The conditioning process had evolved far beyond the crude brainwashing techniques of earlier eras. The 7 families had developed methods that could alter personality, memory, and even basic perception of reality. Children who entered the program would emerge as perfectly functional members of society, but with hidden programming that could be activated when needed. They would go on to live normal lives, pursuing careers, raising families, participating in their communities. But buried deep in their psyches were instructions that would activate under specific conditions. These sleeper agents represented the family's long-term strategy for the Great Awakening. When the time came for the final phase of their plan, thousands of seemingly ordinary people would simultaneously activate. Teachers would begin indoctrinating their students with cult ideology. Politicians would introduce legislation that advanced the family's agenda. Media personalities would shift public opinion on key issues. Law enforcement officers would ignore crimes committed by cult members while cracking down on anyone who opposed them. The financial dimension of the operation was equally sophisticated. The 7 families had learned to use modern financial instruments to multiply their wealth and influence exponentially. They had created a network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and investment funds that allowed them to manipulate markets, destabilize economies, and accumulate resources on a scale that dwarfed most nation-states. But money was just a tool. The real currency was human consciousness itself. The families had developed techniques for harvesting and concentrating what they called psychic energy from large populations. Major sporting events, political rallies, religious gatherings, and even social media trends could be manipulated to generate specific emotional states in millions of people simultaneously. This collective emotional energy could then be channeled and directed toward specific goals. The technology for this harvesting was hidden in plain sight. Cell phone towers, Wi-Fi routers, and even smart home devices had been modified to detect and measure the electromagnetic signatures of human emotions. The data was collected, processed, and analyzed by AI systems that could identify optimal times and methods for psychological manipulation. When millions of people were experiencing fear, anger, or despair simultaneously, that energy could be concentrated and directed toward weakening the barriers between dimensions. The ultimate goal remained the same as it had been for centuries. The 7 families believed they were preparing Earth for the return of entities they called the Ancient Ones. These beings, according to cult doctrine, had ruled the planet in prehistoric times before being banished to parallel dimensions. The families saw themselves as the chosen servants who would facilitate this return and be rewarded with positions of power in the New World Order. But the Ancient Ones weren't just waiting passively for their return. They were actively influencing events through the dimensional barriers. The increasing frequency of unexplained phenomena, the rise of mental illness, the breakdown of social institutions, and the growing sense of existential dread that seemed to permeate modern society were all signs that the barriers were weakening. The families had calculated that the optimal time for the Great Awakening would be during a period of maximum social chaos and psychological vulnerability. They had spent decades engineering the conditions that would create this perfect storm. Environmental disasters, economic collapse, political polarization, and social fragmentation were all part of their design. When society finally reached its breaking point, the families would reveal themselves as the solution to humanity's problems. The most terrifying aspect of their plan was how close they had come to success. By 2020, all the pieces were in place. The digital surveillance network was operational. The sleeper agents were positioned throughout society. The psychological conditioning of the population was nearly complete. The financial systems were primed for collapse. The environmental disasters were accelerating. The political institutions were crumbling. But something had gone wrong. The carefully orchestrated timeline had been disrupted by variables the families hadn't anticipated. Some of their key operatives had been exposed. Critical facilities had been compromised. The coordination between the 7 bloodlines had begun to break down as each family pursued its own vision of the Great Awakening. Sarah Chen's investigation had played a crucial role in this disruption. Her team had managed to introduce viruses into the hidden server network that corrupted key databases and communication systems. More importantly, they had begun exposing the truth to people who were positioned to act on it. Intelligence agencies, law enforcement departments, and even some corporate executives were beginning to understand the scope of the threat. The family's response was swift and brutal. Sarah's team members began experiencing the same psychological warfare that had been used against her. Some disappeared entirely. Others suffered apparent mental breakdowns that left them unable to continue their work. But the damage had been done. The network that had operated in shadow for so long was beginning to be exposed to the light. The battle for human consciousness had entered a new phase. The 7 families of Appalachia were no longer hidden threats operating from mountain hollows. They had become a technologically sophisticated enemy that had infiltrated the very foundations of modern civilization. Their ultimate goal remained the same as it had been for centuries, but their methods had evolved to match the complexity of the modern world. The question that haunted Sarah Chen as she continued her investigation was whether humanity could recognize and resist this threat before it was too late. The families had spent generations studying human psychology, developing techniques for manipulation and control that were nearly impossible to detect. They had created a system so pervasive and sophisticated that most people couldn't even imagine its existence. But they had also made a crucial error. In their arrogance, they had assumed that their victims would remain passive and unaware. They had underestimated the human capacity for resistance, for truth-seeking, for the kind of courage that could face seemingly impossible odds and refuse to surrender. The ancient evil that had taken root in the Appalachian Mountains was no longer contained by geography or limited by primitive technology. It had grown into something vast and terrible, a shadow network that reached into every aspect of human society. But for the first time in centuries, it was no longer invisible. The war for the future of human consciousness had begun. But even as Sarah Chen's investigation exposed the surface operations of these interconnected Appalachian cults, the most disturbing revelation was yet to come. The network she'd uncovered represented only the visible layer of something far more ancient and terrifying. Deep in the archives of the Smithsonian Institution, buried beneath decades of bureaucratic misfiling, lay documents that would shatter everything she thought she understood about the true scope of their influence. The files, marked with symbols that matched those found in the underground chambers, contained correspondence dating back to 1847. Letters written in multiple languages, some in dialects that linguistic experts couldn't identify, revealed that these 7 cults were never separate entities at all. They were regional branches of a single organization that had been operating across the Appalachian Mountains for over 2 centuries, each family group serving as guardians of specific territories and carrying out distinct but interconnected functions in service of their ultimate goal. The Thornwood Circle, as they called themselves in their encrypted communications, had divided the mountains into 7 sacred territories, each corresponding to what they believed were key geographic points where the barrier between dimensions grew thin. The Whitmore family controlled the northeastern territories, focusing on recruitment and psychological conditioning. The Hensley clan managed the southeastern regions, specializing in biological experimentation and genetic manipulation. Blackwood's followers dominated the central mountains, serving as the network's spiritual and ceremonial leaders. Marcus Thorne's group controlled the western territories, functioning as the organization's financial and logistical backbone, while the remaining 3 families managed the northern, southern, and eastern boundaries respectively. Each territory contained multiple underground facilities, connected by a vast network of tunnels that had been carved over generations, creating a subterranean highway system that allowed movement between regions without detection. The documents revealed that the great work was not merely about awakening ancient entities, but about preparing specific geographic locations for their return. The Thornwood Circle believed that the Appalachian Mountains sat atop a convergence of what they called ley lines, invisible channels of energy that connected their dimension to others. Their rituals, experiments, and sacrifices were designed to gradually weaken these dimensional barriers at precise points, creating gateways that would allow the entities they worshipped to enter our reality. What made this revelation truly horrifying was the timeline. According to their records, the process was nearly complete. 7 major gateways had been prepared over the past century and a half, each one requiring specific astronomical alignments and massive amounts of what they termed life force energy harvested from their victims. The convergence they had been working toward was scheduled to occur during the next lunar eclipse, just 6 months away. The files contained detailed maps showing the locations of these gateways, marked with symbols that corresponded to the different families' territories. Each site was described as containing a central chamber carved deep into the mountain, surrounded by smaller ritual spaces where hundreds of victims had been sacrificed over the decades. The chambers were designed to focus and amplify the energy released during these rituals, gradually charging what they called the threshold stones, massive carved monoliths that would serve as anchors for the dimensional gateways. Sarah's investigation had revealed that the missing persons cases spanning over a century weren't random disappearances at all, but carefully orchestrated harvesting operations. The Thornwood Circle had been systematically selecting victims based on specific criteria: age, genetic markers, psychological profiles, and even astrological considerations. They believed that certain individuals possessed higher concentrations of life force energy, making them more valuable for their rituals. The network's infiltration of local institutions wasn't just about avoiding detection, it was about controlling the supply of victims. Social workers, teachers, police officers, and medical professionals who had been corrupted by the cult helped identify suitable candidates and ensured that investigations into disappearances were misdirected or abandoned. The foster care system had been particularly compromised, with several facilities serving as recruitment centers where vulnerable children were evaluated and selected for various purposes within the organization. But the most chilling discovery in the archives was evidence that the Thornwood Circle had been expanding beyond the Appalachian region. Similar networks had been established in other mountain ranges across North America, each one following the same pattern of territorial division and gradual infiltration. The Rocky Mountains, the Sierra Nevada, the Adirondacks, and even parts of the Canadian Rockies contained cells that reported back to the original Appalachian leadership. The global reach of their influence became apparent through financial records showing money laundering operations that spanned multiple continents. Shell companies registered in various countries had been funneling resources back to the mountain communities, allowing them to purchase advanced technology and establish legitimate businesses that served as fronts for their activities. Mining operations, timber companies, and tourism businesses throughout the region were either directly owned by cult members or had been infiltrated at the highest levels. The technological aspect of their operations was particularly sophisticated. While maintaining their ancient rituals and beliefs, the Thornwood Circle had embraced modern surveillance and communication systems. Satellite networks allowed them to monitor vast areas of wilderness, while encrypted digital communications enabled coordination between distant cells. They had even developed their own social media platforms and dating apps designed to identify and recruit individuals with specific psychological profiles or genetic markers. The recruitment process had evolved far beyond the crude methods of earlier generations. Using advanced psychological profiling and data mining techniques, they could identify potential converts years before making contact. Social media activity, online purchases, medical records, and even genetic testing results were all analyzed to create detailed profiles of suitable candidates. The approach was then tailored to each individual's specific vulnerabilities and desires, making the recruitment process incredibly effective. Young people struggling with depression, anxiety, or feelings of alienation were particularly targeted. The cult's recruiters, often appearing as counselors, spiritual guides, or romantic interests, would gradually introduce concepts of ancient wisdom, hidden knowledge, and the promise of belonging to something greater than themselves. The process could take months or even years, with victims being slowly isolated from their support networks and drawn deeper into the organization's influence. The role of technology in their operations extended to their ritual practices as well. While maintaining the appearance of primitive ceremonies, they had incorporated electromagnetic field generators, infrasound devices, and even experimental consciousness-altering technologies into their rituals. These devices were designed to enhance the psychological impact of their ceremonies and increase the efficiency of their energy harvesting processes. The archives contained detailed schematics for devices that could allegedly measure and manipulate what they called psychic energy. Whether these technologies actually worked as intended or were simply elaborate props designed to impress and intimidate participants remained unclear, but the sophistication of the engineering suggested significant resources and expertise had been invested in their development. Perhaps most disturbing was evidence that the Thornwood Circle had been conducting experiments on their own members, particularly children born into the cult. Genetic manipulation, psychological conditioning, and even surgical modifications were documented in clinical detail. They were attempting to create what they called perfect vessels, individuals whose consciousness could be more easily controlled or even replaced by the entities they sought to summon. The breeding programs revealed in the documents showed that cult families had been carefully managing bloodlines for generations, maintaining detailed genetic records, and arranging marriages to produce offspring with specific traits. Children showing signs of psychic sensitivity, unusual intelligence, or particular physical characteristics were subjected to intensive conditioning from birth, designed to prepare them for specific roles within the organization. The conditioning process involved a combination of psychological manipulation, chemical treatments, and exposure to various forms of radiation and electromagnetic fields. The goal was to create individuals who could serve as intermediaries between dimensions, capable of communicating with the entities the cult worshipped and eventually allowing these beings to inhabit their bodies as permanent vessels. The success of these programs was documented through case studies of individuals who had undergone the complete conditioning process. These subjects displayed remarkable abilities, including apparent telepathy, precognition, and the ability to influence others' thoughts and emotions. Whether these abilities were genuine or the result of elaborate psychological manipulation remained unclear, but the impact on both the subjects and those around them was undeniable. The archives revealed that several of these conditioned individuals had been placed in positions of influence throughout society, serving as the cult's agents in government, academia, and industry. Their enhanced persuasive abilities and apparent supernatural insights made them incredibly effective at advancing the organization's agenda while maintaining complete loyalty to the Thornwood Circle's ultimate goals. As Sarah continued her investigation, she discovered that the cult's influence extended into the highest levels of government and international organizations. Congressional representatives, federal judges, military officers, and even members of intelligence agencies had been either recruited or replaced by conditioned agents. The scope of infiltration was so extensive that distinguishing between legitimate officials and cult operatives had become nearly impossible. The realization that the Thornwood Circle possessed this level of influence explained how they had managed to operate for so long without significant interference. Investigations were terminated, evidence disappeared, and witnesses were discredited or eliminated with disturbing efficiency. The network had essentially created a shadow government that operated parallel to official institutions, wielding enormous power while remaining completely invisible to the public. The approaching lunar eclipse represented the culmination of over 2 centuries of preparation. According to their calculations, the astronomical alignment would create optimal conditions for opening the dimensional gateways they had been preparing. The energy accumulated through decades of rituals and sacrifices would be released simultaneously across all 7 sites, creating a cascading effect that would permanently weaken the barriers between dimensions. The entities they sought to summon were described in the archives as beings of immense power and malevolent intelligence, creatures that existed in dimensions where the laws of physics and reality operated according to different principles. Their arrival would fundamentally alter the nature of existence on Earth, transforming human civilization into something unrecognizable and utterly hostile to human consciousness. Sarah realized that exposing the cult's activities through conventional means would be impossible given their level of infiltration and influence. Any attempt to alert authorities would likely result in the information being suppressed and her own elimination. The only hope lay in finding a way to disrupt their preparations before the eclipse, but the scale of the operation and the time remaining made success seem almost impossible. The weight of this knowledge was overwhelming. Sarah understood that she might be the only person outside the cult who fully comprehended the magnitude of the threat facing humanity. The responsibility for preventing what amounted to the end of the world as we know it rested entirely on her shoulders, and the clock was ticking toward a deadline that would determine the fate of human civilization itself. The 7 cults we've explored represent just the tip of an iceberg deep within the Appalachian Mountains. Despite ongoing law enforcement investigations, centuries-old roots and sophisticated operations make these networks hard to fully expose. When driving the winding roads of Appalachia, remember that beneath these hills lies a web of secrets that could reshape our understanding of the world. Stay vigilant, informed, and aware that these forces may still be active in communities across the region.